This is the GeoDware Game Jam, a jam where I had to make a video game within 10 days. Now, I've only participated in 2 other jams with subpar results. Ow. Ow. Oh, wait, I'm still walking. Do I just win? Done! I won! But my main goal with these is to learn more about Godot and understand the process of making a game from start to finish. But remember when I said this was a 10-day game jam? Well, the first day was taken by work, which was also the same for the first half of the second day as well. So I really only had 8.5 days to do this jam. But while I was at work, that first day, they did announce the theme of the jam. And that theme was consequences. And with that theme, even though I was at work, I started brainstorming, so it wasn't a total setback. Lately, I've been getting interested in the roguelike genre. Just the idea of starting a new run, slowly upgrading, getting stronger throughout a randomly generated level seemed pretty fun to me. And the randomness of these games make each new playthrough different than the last, giving the games a lot of replayability. So with this theme of consequence, I felt like a roguelike seemed like it would fit pretty well. The decisions you make in roguelikes usually affect the entire rest of your run, and you sometimes immediately see those consequences. One day I brought this up to a friend that I go to the gym with. We started brainstorming some mechanics with this idea, and he mentioned that he recently watched Cyberpunk Edgerunners, a show that has people replace their body parts with upgraded robotic parts. But the more parts they replaced, they would become more of what was called a cyber psycho, essentially upgrading themselves at the price of losing their own sanity. And after I heard this, I thought, what if I made a roguelike with a sanity mechanic, and every time you take an upgrade, your sanity goes down, making the game more difficult. This would give kind of a risk-reward element to every single decision you make. And after I brainstormed a few ideas, that's the one that I went with. So as soon as I was finished with my in-person responsibilities, I went home and created a small Figjam to plan out this game idea. Figjam is a website for planning. I'll leave it in the description below. I made a small mock-up of what the main gameplay loop will look like, kind of Binding of Isaac style dungeon crawling, but only in one direction in a more linear style. This decision was made with the 8 days I had left in mind, and making a full dungeon all directions would probably have been a bit too ambitious with my current abilities, so I went with a more linear approach. You would go through a random room out of a list of pre-made layouts, defeat all the monsters inside that room, and be given a choice of rewards. But with each reward, there is a downside of losing your sanity, with some rewards taking away more sanity than others. So you could choose any of these, or you could skip the rewards and get some sanity back instead. The sanity mechanic would spawn more enemies in these rooms as your sanity gets lower and lower. And with this plan, I started developing. Since I'm currently trying to learn Godot, I settled with that engine for this game jam. Some other tools I use during this project is Trello to keep track of a to-do list, as well as GitHub Desktop for version control in case I need to go back to previous versions. I'll leave a link to all these programs I use below. I started a new project and started creating a prototype top-down game with an asset pack that I found on itch.io. Big shout out to this pack. I'm not very good at art, and because I'm not with a team, using this pack was a huge time saver for me, and I'll also link that down below. So I actually immediately ran into a problem where some of the tiles in this asset pack would take up 2 squares and some would take up 1. This made it difficult to make a tile map I could easily place. So because I really liked this tile set and I didn't want to find a new one, I opted to just build my rooms manually with each square. On larger games, this would have turned out bad, but here it was good enough. On that note, something I learned in these past game jams is that good enough is good enough. With the small amount of time you're given, you shouldn't spend time making things perfect, really. And having this mindset saved me a lot of time in these game jams. After the room was made, I added collision to that tile map and decorated the room a little bit. I then watched a tutorial on how someone might approach an item system in Godot. This tutorial used Godot's custom resource system to create a framework for each item to follow, and I decided to go with this. One thing I wanted to emphasize while making this game is scalability. Roguelikes have a lot of upgrades, enemies, weapons, you name it. Having to remake code for each one of these would take forever. So creating a template for each item makes it so that when I create a new one of those, it'll follow that template and I can add new content to the game very easily. After this, I created the door that'll open when you beat all the enemies. At first, I used the door provided by the tile map, but since this door only faced vertically and I wanted the player to move from left to right, I just went with a wall that opens up instead. Once the base room was made, I started on the procedural generation of the dungeon. Because this dungeon is just left to right, I just made an array that holds all of the rooms in it that I created beforehand. Then, when the player exits a room, it'll shuffle that array around, pick a room from it, and spawn that room in. Then the camera goes to that new room. I think it turned out pretty great. Once the dungeon generation was complete, I started working on a base enemy that the rest of the enemies would inherit from. For this, I decided to bring in a finite state machine that I had used in a previous game jam. I got it from a tutorial by Bitlytic, and I love the code they use, so I wanted to use that again. This state machine made it easy for the enemy to transition between being idle, following the enemy, attacking, getting hit, etc. When it came to enemy AI, I felt that I needed to do a bit more research, so I booted up Binding of Isaac to get a better understanding of some of the enemy AI that you find in that game. Like, for example, these flies would follow the player in a snake-like pattern and only follow the player horizontally or vertically, which I thought was pretty interesting. But this room in particular stood out to me. Some enemies are following the player, trying to run themselves into you, as well as a stationary enemy that shoots projectiles far away. This gives players the choice to go for the defensive enemies first or the aggressive ones. I liked this concept and started working on some AI that would match it. At this point, I finally gave the player one of the main weapons, the sword. I originally wanted to give weapons the option of an element like fire and ice, but I never ended up adding that due to time. I then animated an attack animation for the player and gave it a sword trail. Here's the result. The way to progress in this game is by receiving rewards after defeating all the enemies in the room. So I started by making a chest that when the player touches, a rewards menu will show up. And this is what I learned, that UI sucks. I hate UI. I know it's not just Godot. I realize that in game dev, UI is just a pain in general. People's screens are different, and if you don't account for those different screens and resolutions, then most of your players aren't going to have a good time. Thankfully, Godot does have a built-in system to adapt to player screens, but it doesn't make it any less painful to deal with. This game will have a lot of upgrades, so I needed to, again, emphasize on scalability. I wanted to make a framework where I could add a brand new upgrade in just a couple of clicks and have that upgrade show up randomly on the rewards menu. This system took a lot of work and many frustrating bugs, like having the reward show up multiple times or not even at all. The reward will say what it does and the amount of sanity that will be removed or added. I wanted to make it clear to the player what good things you're getting and what bad things you're getting. Nothing too complicated, otherwise a big wall of text could be intimidating for new players. Since I was already on UI, I figured this would be a good time to add the health and sanity UI. For this, I actually found a website that has an entire database of different video game UIs that can be used for reference. I'll leave a link to it below. I found this UI from Rogue Legacy 2, and I thought that putting the stats in the corner was a pretty good idea, since it keeps the UI out of the way from the actual gameplay. The health was a bit tricky. I wanted to use hearts similar to the Binding of Isaac, but a single heart was actually essentially 2 health, since they can be a half heart as well. Kind of like Minecraft, as you only have 10 visible hearts in that game, but you really have 20 health. So I had to do a bit more math than I expected, but eventually got it working. Then when it came to the sanity UI, I wanted a bar to display how much you have left. But bars can be a bit ambiguous, so I put the actual number of how much you have left along with that bar. This way you can tell exactly how much sanity you have, but also a visual paired with that number. Once I was done with this, the main gameplay loop was really starting to come along. A certain amount of enemies should spawn depending on your current sanity. It's the sanity mechanic that provides the consequences, so it was time to implement it. This was a lot of math, but basically I put a bunch of spawners in each of the rooms. Then when that room is created, it'll spawn an enemy on only a percentage of those spawners. For each 1 sanity you lose, that percentage increases by 1, tying sanity directly to the spawn rate of the enemies. It was time to implement some enemies following the player, and since some rooms might have solid walls between the player and enemy, I needed some form of enemy pathfinding for them to go around those walls. Luckily, Godot has a built-in node for this, and the process of implementing it was pretty simple. With most of the game loop complete, it was time to add more content. With enemy spawning and the chest reward already set up, it felt like a good time to add more rooms. I tried my best to have the rooms vary in size and shape, but when it's only left to right, there's only so many variations you can have. After that, I added more upgrades, some with a lot of variation. Some upgrades will even give you sanity back, but will provide a debuff to the player in return. Shoutouts to a friend of mine for giving me that idea. Then afterwards, I added the second weapon in the game, the bow. The bow is what got me to add a charge mechanic in the first place. At first, the game was only playable with keyboard and mouse, but I know some people like to prefer to play games like these with just the keyboard, which would have been difficult if the bow immediately shot in the direction you're moving. So a charge state that slows down the player would allow the keyboard players to aim in the direction they want to move without moving in that same direction. It was after this that I added knockback, which was a bit of a headache, but I eventually figured it out. One of the last things I added was the tutorial, but don't underestimate a good, clear tutorial. They can be essential to players understanding your game. I decided to, again, take inspiration from Binding of Isaac and make a tutorial that's on the floor of the starting room. Always see it when you start a new run, and to continue past the tutorial, you have to apply those controls and kill the first enemy. I made the enemy in the tutorial room not shoot projectiles and remain stationary, so the player can take their time understanding the controls. For the menu, I used a Godot template that I'll leave in the description below. The template gives you a simple main menu, options, and credits menus. Because of this, implementing a menu didn't take that much time at all and gave me more time to add another tutorial that explains the sanity mechanic. The audio was pretty straightforward for me. I scoured a couple of websites for a sound I might like, put it on Audacity, made some tweaks, and then put it in the game. Sites like OpenGameArt, itch.io, Asset Store, and freesound.org are a big help for this. Lastly, before I export and publish the project, I spent a couple of hours playtesting the game with some friends. I had them playtest the game while on a call with me. I wrote down all the bugs that they encountered and tried my best to fix them in the time that I have left. Let me tell you, allocating time to playtest your game is worth it. You need to make sure you have some time to playtest your game, as I had so many bugs that I never would have caught otherwise. If you don't have immediate access to playtesters, a good way to find them is to head over to the Discord of the jam that you're in and ask some people around. After a lot of playtesting and a little bit of polish by adding a lighting system, it was done. It was complete. I was out of time, really. So I went and created an itch.io page for the game. I made a thumbnail for it and I clicked publish. I submitted it to the game jam, and at this point, it was like 4 a.m. I was really tired, but I will say overall, this jam was a lot of fun. I made a game I was pretty happy with, and going through the other submissions was also a lot of fun as well. If you have ever been curious about joining a game jam, just know that it doesn't matter if the game you make isn't the next Lethal Company or Vampire Survivors. It just has to be yours, you know? Give it a try, you won't regret it. If you like this video, feel free to subscribe, stick around. I plan to make more videos like this, more game dev stuff. I appreciate it. Have a good one.